I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with Noel Miller of Belmont, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Noel, can you start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Sure. I was born in Lima, Ohio, March 23rd, 1949, and my father and mother owned a farm in Harrod, Ohio, so I was brought up on a farm till I was 5 years old. Then we moved to Findlay, Ohio. My father was a corporate pilot working for Cooper Tire and Rubber Company. And I spent the rest of my childhood, and I graduated from Findlay High School in 1967.
Okay. Now, had your father had a pilot's license already, or how did he wind up with
Yes, my
that?
father was a flight instructor during World War II down in Alabama. His favorite airplane he ever flew was a PT-17, a Stearman biplane. And he flew anything from Piper Cubs to Super Constellations. Flew for TWA for 2 years after the war. I didn't like the life of an airline pilot then, because as a co-pilot, his job was to polish the aircraft when they landed. You know. And so he got back into farming. It was his father's farm.
Right.
And but we left in, oh gosh, it was 1954, I believe, and went to this little town called Findlay, Ohio. And that's where I grew up.
Okay. Now, when did you finish high school?
It was 1967. And at that point in time, I really had no clear idea what I wanted to do. I still wanted to be a fireman, because at the age of early 18, this is a big world. You don't know what you want to do.
Right.
There was this thing called Vietnam, which I really knew was just a 7-letter word and what Walter Cronkite explained on television. But I knew that people getting out of college at that point were being drafted. And I knew I had to have a college education, so I figured I'll get the Army thing done, I'd get the Vietnam thing done, and then come back and go to school. But I knew I didn't want to be an infantry soldier because it didn't look that inviting from the evening news. And there were these things called helicopters. And being based in aviation, my father was a pilot, I flew with him a lot. I wanted to fly. My first experience with a helicopter, I was maybe 10 years old in Reading, Pennsylvania, at a maintenance and operations meeting that we went to every year for vacation. And I got a ride in a Bell 47 series. My dad lost me, and here I am flying around Pennsylvania countryside in a helicopter. And he finally found me when I landed and hopped out, and that was the greatest experience I'd ever had in my small life. And that translated into enlisting into the Army to fly helicopters.
Now, when did you actually enlist?
It was in April of 1968, was my basic pay entry date.
Okay.
And I left in early June. It was a 120-day delay program. I enlisted now, and they would put together a class.
Right.
So about 3 weeks after I enlisted, I got a letter in the mail, said to report to Columbus, Ohio, on, I believe it was June 10th, 1968.
Now, when you were enlisting, were you getting to specify what kind of training you wanted, or how did that work?
Yes, I took an aptitude test, and I passed the aptitude test, luckily. For me, it was kind of easy, because I'd been around that for years and years and years. But I headed off. They put me in.
But there was one specialized for aviation?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. It was an aptitude test for flying helicopters, or just aviation. If you could understand what the terms were, what they meant.
Right.
Of course, I flew with my dad ever since I was old enough to stack 4 Jepson manuals on the seat of a Bonanza and look over the control panel. You know, I went with him.
Yeah.
But I hadn't passed a flight physical at that point, and that was a worrying spot. What would happen if I didn't pass a flight physical? Well, I'd be put into an infantry platoon, infantry. So, yeah, it was a gamble. It was a gamble.
Yeah, it was a flight physical. Now, did they differentiate between helicopter training and fixed wing, or was it all the same physical?
It was all the same.
Okay.
It was all, you know, the flight surgeons did the physical, and they were very tough physicals. You know, they dilated my eyes, and I couldn't see for 3 days after. But after the initial flight training physical. From then on, it was walk, talk, see lightning, hear thunder. You passed your physical.
Right.
You know.
Okay. So you've got to actually go in June. You report initially to Columbus for processing, and where do you go then for basic
Right.
training?
They sent us to Fort Polk, Louisiana, even though there was basic training bases closer
Yep.
to Ohio. That's where they sent all the warrant officer candidates, warrant officer training candidates, and because it was closer to Fort Walters, Texas. So there was, I think it was 10 weeks down at Fort Polk, Louisiana, which is a very strange place to be. We got down there in the middle of the night. We flew on a civilian airliner, then got on an old DC-3, landed at Fort Polk about midnight, and my God, it was dark. We had no idea where we were. Went up to a dark green building with a light over the door, and somebody in a green uniform started yelling at us, throwing cots and blankets and things, and go in here and that's building and find the cot. My God, I didn't get a minute's sleep because, you know, there was probably 50 guys on each floor and people were snoring, and I had no idea where I was.
Okay. So you really didn't have any idea what to expect when you showed up for training?
No, nothing. Nothing at all.
And then what kind of processing and stuff do you go through then after that?
It took 2 weeks to go through the processing station, and then basic training started after about 2 weeks worth of.
Okay. So what did they do in those first 2 weeks?
Yelled at us a lot of paperwork, a lot of testing, physicals, shots, just adapting to military life, getting used to it before we got into the real hardcore basic training.
Okay. And then when you go into the basic training, that's sort of the standard 8-week sequence then at that point. You've had your first two before you start, and then you do that. Now, were you getting the same basic that all the infantry got?
Yes, yes. Fort Polk was an infantry base. I was on North Fort, and the education I got in my 3rd platoon was just phenomenal. Most of the fellows in that basic training company were draftees, and they would cry themselves asleep at night because they were drafted. Some of them went AWOL, never saw them again. One of them committed suicide, never saw him again. But I was there, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I had to go through this basic training to get where I wanted to go. So, and I wanted to be there. I wanted to end up as a pilot, and I knew that this was a stepping stone. So my attitude was such, this is what I have to do.
Okay. But you were not in a group that was all made up of people who were going into aviation training. You were just a bunch of people sent from Ohio down to Fort Polk.
Correct. There was, in our whole basic training company, maybe about 15 to 20 warrant officer flight training people who were going to go on.
Okay.
So we, within the 8 weeks, we kind of found each other,
Right.
and palled around.
Okay. Now, were you doing a lot of training outside?
Oh yes,
Okay.
yeah. I took basic training in June, July, and August
Yeah, in Louisiana.
in Louisiana, and you know, the palmetto bugs, you know, had names, you know, and it was hot and humid, but we had to endure it.
Okay.
Had
And
to.
what kind of people did you have training you?
There were people that were so illiterate they couldn't even sign their own names. There was one fella in my platoon, the black fella, who was one of the funniest persons I've ever met in my life, was in the Army because he killed his grandmother. So it was either go to the Army or go to prison. And Sammy took the Army. And whatever happened to Sammy Joseph, I don't know. I hope he survived because he was one of the nicest guys, funniest men I've ever met in my life.
All right.
And another fella named McDonald was Cajun. He snuck off to the PX one Sunday afternoon, and the barracks were old barracks and had mop closets on the outside of the barracks, and one of the mop closet doors was open. When he came back from the PX, that he wasn't supposed to go to, he snuck around the back of the barracks and snuck up behind the door and looked through the cracks in the door. There was a little knothole, and he was looking through that knothole, and we were probably 30 yards away, standing in formation. They called a quick formation in the company street. And McDonald was looking through that little knothole, and of course, the bottom of the door was about at his waist. And of course the TAC officer, not TAC officers, but our drill sergeants retrieved him. He could not understand how they saw him through that knothole. He was just amazed that they, how did they see me through that crack in that wood and that knothole? Well, of course, from the waist down, there was his long legs. And those were the kind of people we had in basic training. They were defending our country.
Right. Okay. And what about the instructors? What kind of backgrounds did they have, as far as you could tell?
Our senior drill sergeant was a tough guy, but he had a heart of gold. He was the best. He taught us well. He taught us to be men. He taught us to think for ourselves.
Had he been to Vietnam?
Yes, twice. And tall, loud, boisterous, but we loved him. The assistant senior drill sergeant was a little short guy. He was an alcoholic. And he loved to show up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning after he went to the NCO club and awake us and tell us of his stories at the NCO club. That we really couldn't hear when we were doing push-ups at 3 o'clock in the morning, So we went from the ridiculous to the sublime. My drill sergeant, Sergeant Goodrich, when we were lining up at the end of our primary training, before we got into basic training company, we saw this guy and I said, God, I hope I don't get him. He was an African-American drill sergeant. His hat was way down and he'd look, and he looked tough. He had scars on his face. And God, I hope I don't get that guy. I did. And he was one of the nicest fellas. He was very quiet. You had to really shut up to listen to him. But he was very fair. He had a sense of humor, but he taught us well. He taught us well. Senior drill sergeant and Sergeant Goodrich, are two very important people in my memory. And after I learned afterward that Senior Drill Sergeant was killed on his 3rd tour. And we were all very sad about that. His 3rd tour in Vietnam.
All right. Now, did most of the people that you said you had, some people kind of went AWOL or had other issues, did most of the men who started in the company finish with it?
I believe so. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And then now that you're done, what do they do with you?
They put us on a bus. Most of the fellows went to AIT, Advanced Infantry Training, but they put us on a bus and shipped us to Fort Walters, Texas, which is on the west side of Dallas-Fort Worth. And it was a very pleasant bus ride. We had a day to enjoy ourselves until we rolled up in front of the 8th WAC Company, and about 4 uniformed officers with black helmet liners, sunglasses, the most impressive uniform I've ever seen, starched and pressed, got on the bus. And we must have done something wrong because they were yelling at us the second they got on the bus. And it was an eye-opener. We had to fall out on the company street, a big, huge asphalt area behind the 8th WAC. WAC is WOC, Warrant Officer Candidate. And originally there was 275 men in my Warrant Officer Candidate company, the 8th WAC. 75 quit the first day. And within the first hour, they said, I'm out of here. And they were all prior service, E5s, E6s that had put in for flight school. And, they'd been in the Army for years, and they didn't need some upstart chief warrant officer screaming and yelling at them. So they said, I've had enough of this. And they went back to their supply rooms or whatever. And we never saw them again.
All right. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily even know quite what a warrant officer is. Can you kind of explain that?
Well, a warrant officer is a specialty rank. They have a specialized mission. They do one thing. Me as a pilot, that was my job. They have warrant officers that work in supply, some in communications. But during the Vietnam War, the prevalent variety was the warrant officers, pilots. The warrant officers have all the privileges of an officer, but don't have the responsibilities of a commissioned officer. As a warrant, we didn't have to pull officer of the day. We didn't have to do reports of survey. We went out and flew. And when we were done flying, that's all we did. So it was really the best of both worlds.
But it also meant you didn't have to have quite the same level of qualifications to go in terms of education and so forth that you
Correct.
did to be an officer. Because officers usually at least had some college. I mean, there were some people who go through OCS who would come out, rise up from the ranks, but the standard was more somebody with the college degree does OCS
Correct.
or OTC.
Yeah, most of the commissioned officers, like the butter bars, second lieutenants we call them, butter bars, they went through ROTC in college. But to be a warrant officer pilot, all that was needed then was a high school diploma. And because they needed pilots.
Yes.
They needed pilots badly.
All right. So you had chosen a particular specialization that they're quite happy to have you choose. So not a problem giving that to you as long as you pass the tests.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So you have the initial shock of being back, having a bunch of people yelling at you and so forth, which just coming out of basic training is no big deal. But if you've been in the service for a while and on active duty, coming back to that, maybe not.
It's like coming home, you know, your second college semester and going to your buddy's house and have her mom yell at you, you know, like, who are you and why are you doing this?
Yes.
You know, what did I do? You know.
All right. So what now does the training actually consist of? Take us through the course.
Well, at Fort Walters, it was the primary helicopter training school. Our first 4 weeks, our first month was what they called pre-flight. And that is where we go to classes in the morning and then to more classes in the afternoon, intermixed with PT, getting our helmets, all our flight gear lined up, more tests, more aptitude tests, just getting used to being warrant officer candidates. When there was a lot of harassment, 24 hours a day, we had to learn to, our rooms were a 3-man room. We had a display of our uniforms. There's 3 sets of drawers, and all our underwear had to be rolled, and we got plastic tubes to roll our underwear and our T-shirts. All our warrant officer candidate brass, it had to be, you know, X number of inches, and I mean, right on. And all these drawers tiered out. Your first drawer so many inches, second drawer so many inches. Everything hanging in the closet hangers had to be, you know, 3 fingers wide, and all the buttons buttoned. It was to teach you discipline. This is the way we do it. You know, your name tag isn't 2 inches from the left, it's 2 1/8 inches. And that's the way we do it. So it taught self-discipline.
How long did it take to get that kind of thing down?
About 4 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't think it would ever get done. We could get a weekend pass, and I think the first week, if you had less than 5,000 demerits, you could go on a weekend pass. Well, nobody went on a weekend pass, you know, because we were issued 2 sets of boots, combat boots, and a pair of dress shoes, and they had to be high spit shined, and the first little mark on your shoes or boots, that was like 1,000 demerits right there. And where my bunk was, where I had to put my boots and shoes, the sun would shine in through the glass windows, heat up the polish, and they would just turn very flat, like they were painted flat black. I never got by one single day without getting demerits on my boots because the sun would ruin the spit shine. If I was on the other side of the room, wouldn't have been a problem, but I was in the sunlight. And God forbid if there was a dead bug in your drawer, in your desk drawer. My roommate had a dead fly in his drawer. The fly got in there and just died. And the TAC officers found it. And they took him out in the back, and he had to dig an 8 by 8 by 8 square hole and bury the fly. Put the dirt back in it. The TAC officer asked him, was that a male or female fly? And he had not yet learned to make a decision. And he said, sir, candidate Malloy, I don't know, sir. He will dig it up and find out. And what they were trying to do was teach teamwork. There's no individuals. This is not an individual war. You need to be a team. And they would pick on individuals just to see what we would do. And we finally got tired of that. And one day, one of the fellows was coming back by himself, which you don't do. you always walk with 2 or 3 other warrant officer candidates, trying to teach you that you have to work as a team. You don't fly alone in Vietnam. You never go out by yourself. And you never go out by yourself behind the 8th Walk Company, because you're going to get ambushed by TAC officers. And this one poor guy was walking back from the mess hall, and the TAC officers ambushed him. They were around him, and he was doing push-ups till he couldn't stand it. So we decided we're going to do an insertion. So my platoon, my floor, fell out, and we took our name tags off, and we swung them around our heads like rotor blades, and we're saying whop, 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 whop. We went out with the gunships, and they circled first, put in some anti-aircraft fire, and then the Aero Scout came in and scouted the position and swooped out, and then 6 guys who were in the lift platoon went in and picked up this poor warrant officer candidate who was in a prone position, and we all flew back into the barracks and left those 4 TAC officers out there. That's what they were after. They said, finally, you guys are starting to work as a team. And we were marching back from class one afternoon, and we had WOC brass that said WOC on our collars, which had to be highly polished. And on the shirt tab, WOC stood for Warrant Officer Candidate. And before we started flying, we got a lot of harassment. So 2 guys in my flight were going to protest. So they turned their WOC brass upside down as a protest. We were marching back from class, and Mr. Ellis, CW2, who was the TAC officer of one of the other flights. We had 5 flights in the 8th WOC Company. And Mr. Quiet was my TAC officer, a wonderful man. Mr. Ellis said, Mr. Quiet, he says, I was looking at your girls. He said, you got 2 of them here that are a little bit out of uniform. So we got back to the company street, and all 5 flights, there was 5 flights, it was right before chow. They dropped the whole company except for my flight, down in the front leading rest position. And they said, 8th WOC Company, who stands out like a sore thumb? Alpha 4, sir. I was flight A4. So then we had to get down in the front leaning rest position, and except for the 2 guys who had their WOC brass turned upside down. And they got dismissed from flight school that day. They said, you 2 are not working as a team. Your team members relying on you are down here in the front leaning rest position, but you chose to go against regulation, and you just killed the rest of your flight. Go home. Or they went to the infantry. You know, that's what they tried to do, is teach us teamwork.
Okay.
So by the time we started our helicopter training, we were indoctrinated to the teamwork theory.
All right. So what's the helicopter training like?
It's like learning to hover is like trying to stand on a beach ball in the water. They quit really messing with us emotionally at that point in time, because we would have studies, classroom, a half a day, and then go out and fly the other half a day. And it was very rigorous training. We had to pick it up very quick. I was lucky. I soloed. I was the first to solo in my flight. I soloed right at 10 hours, which was the minimum. You had to have at least 10 hours to solo. And the bus, on the way home from the stage field, stopped at the Holiday Inn. And when you solo, they stop at the Holiday Inn and they throw you in a swimming pool at the Holiday Inn. So I was the first one to get soaked. But it was very intense. We had to pick it up fast. And there were those who didn't pick it up. And if they showed promise, they would set them back in the class 2 weeks behind us coming along to give them a bit more training. But we had 2 stages. It was pre-solo, primary, and then advanced, where we learned to use the aircraft in a tactical situation, flying into confined areas, landing on, at that time we called them slopes, but then the Army said, no, that's a derogatory term for our Arvin brothers, so it's landing on an inclined surface, landing on pinnacles, and so, yeah, we learned to use the helicopter in our second period.
And what kinds of helicopters are you flying?
I flew a TH-55. It was built by Hughes Aircraft Corporation, little two-place helicopter. They also flew Bell 13s, TH-13s, and they also flew Hillers. The Bell 13s and the Hillers were larger aircraft, two-blade, seesaw-type rotor systems. I flew the TH-55, which was a fully articulated head, had 3 rotor blades. A very high-powered aircraft, beautiful little airplane flight.
How do they compare with the ones you'd actually fly in Vietnam?
I can compare my Buick that I had compared to my 1953 MGTD. You know, the Hueys you fly was like hovering a house. The smaller aircraft was like driving a sports car. You know, they were helicopters, but yet they weren't. They were two completely different animals. You know, and I love flying both of them.
But the trainers, were they close enough to, you know?
No. The aircraft we flew in Vietnam were turbine-powered aircraft. A gross weight of 10,000 pounds. The TH-55 gross weight was something like 2,500 pounds. It was just a primary trainer, solely a primary trainer.
Okay. So it's like learning to fly in a Piper Cub before you fly a
Exactly.
bigger fixed wing. Okay.
Exactly.
But
then we graduated, after 5 months, we graduated from primary training and went on then to Fort Rucker, Alabama. People asked me if I'd ever been to a foreign country, and I said, yes, L.A. And I've been to L.A., which is lower Alabama. But there we learned to fly instruments. Fort Rucker was a 4-month training period.
Right.
First 4 weeks was primary instrument training, learning to fly with a hood on our helmets and relying solely on the instruments. I flew a TH-13T at that point in time, and I never got to fly the aircraft without the hood. I'd never flown that type of helicopter, but you know, and I really wanted to fly it visually and to get used to flying it, but no, first day. You put the hood on and you fly it, take off from a hooded position and learn to fly the aircraft completely with instruments. And then went to advanced instruments after 4 weeks, where they teach you how to do approaches, ADF approaches, GCA ground control approach. And I was always terrified of a check ride. If I had to take a check ride, I would just melt into jelly. I was terrified.
A check ride?
It was like a test, a flight test. And when I took my check ride for the advanced instrument course, when I was doing my ADF approach, ADF stands for Automatic Direction Finder, I shot the approach backwards. You have an approach plate. It tells you what headings to fly, and when you cross over the marker beacon at 60 or 80 knots, so many seconds, you descend to your minimum descent altitude. If you don't have the field in sight, then you call for a missed approach and go around and execute a missed approach on certain degree headings, whatever your approach plate says. Well, I was so nervous, I shot the ADF approach backwards. And I was on short final, and my instructor, who was a civilian, big guy, was acting as the tower, and I, luckily, to last minute, I figured found out I was doing it wrong. So I called my instructor, who was to tower, and executed a missed approach. And he said, it's a good thing you've done that. Yeah. So I went around and did the ADF approach the right way and got through advanced instruments. And we had one hell of a party that night at the NCO club.
All right. Now, did you go through with the same group all the way from the beginning?
Yes.
At Fort Rucker to the end?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what proportion of that group survived the whole thing?
Well, the first day we had 75 fellows quit, so we ended up the second day with
That was
200.
back at Fort Walters.
At Fort
75,
Walters.
Yeah. Okay. But but it is still that same group that you're with the whole
Yes.
way through both
Yes.
camps. Okay.
Right. And at the end of the second day of Fort Walters, we had 200 people. By the time we graduated in May of 1969, 88 original warrant officer candidates graduated. So over half were either washed out or set back a class or two.
Okay. Now, once you've gotten through all of that and then you have your party, now what do they do with you?
Well, after instruments, we transitioned into the UH-1.
Oh, okay, so you do get to actually fly the stuff that you
we
fly
got
there.
to transition into the Hueys, UH-1s, and I had a civilian instructor who was Cajun as Cajun could be. Could hardly understand him, but he was great. He taught us to fly the aircraft very well, and after 4 weeks of initial contact, we went into 4 weeks of tactics, where we learned to use the Huey, UH-1, in a tactical situation. Again, landing on slopes, pinnacle approaches, confined area operations. And our last mission before we graduated from flight school in tactics, TAC-X, first 2 weeks of tactics was going to a stage field and flying off a stage field every day. The last 2 weeks, they put us out in the field, and we lived in a tent out in the forest and flew out of the woods in a little makeshift airport or helipad every day. And we flew simulated missions. The last mission we had was to fly to Fort Bragg and pick up a graduating class from the Airborne School. And there was, oh gosh, I think we had 60, 70 aircraft flying to Fort Bragg. Well, we had mechanical problems with ours, with our aircraft. The master caution light came on. So we had to turn and go back to Hanchey Army Airfield and get another aircraft. Well, everybody else went on to Fort Bragg, and my TAC-X instructor and my stick buddy and myself just spent the whole day playing with that H model Huey. He taught us how to low level, and and that was so much fun. Just fly just as fast as you can, as low as you can, and high-speed turns and cyclic climbs. And he taught us to really play with the aircraft and really know what it can do. We had more doggone fun. But then graduation day came, and we got our bars, our warrant officer bars, W01 bars, one day, and then the next day we got our wings. And my parents and my sister and my sister's husband went to Fort Rucker, for the graduation. And we got our bars, I think it was like on a Wednesday in the ceremony. We had a big graduation party at the officers club, and I had a bit too much champagne that night. My sister and I closed the place down. We were the last two on the dance floor at 2 a.m. when the band quit. And I went back to a little apartment where a buddy of mine and I were staying. And he came back in the middle of the night because his family was there. He was from Cleveland, Ohio, Tony Tosti. And Tony and his parents went to Holiday Inn. And there I was all by myself. I was inebriated. And I almost missed the award ceremony where I got my wings the next day. I had to call a cab because I couldn't find my car keys. And the cabbie was doing 120 miles an hour to get me to post on time. Flew past the guards, and I got into my seat about 30 seconds before they shut the doors. And if I hadn't been there and not gotten my wings, I would have been shipped off to the infantry.
Wow, even at that point?
At that point.
All right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Now you were living off the base and so forth. So where is Fort Rucker in Alabama?
Fort Rucker is about 2 hours south of Montgomery.
Okay.
And about 2 hours north of the Florida border. About an hour north of Dothan, Alabama. I had a nightclub called the Flamingo, which we called the Dirty Bird, and we had an occasion to visit that place. But it's out in the middle of nowhere, and now Fort Rucker is the primary and advanced flight training center for helicopter operations and fixed wing.
All right. And was that a place, I mean, did you notice sort of the culture or the life there being different from what we're used to in Ohio?
Oh, yes, exactly. Some of the best food I've ever had was down there. There was a little restaurant called the Ice House. They produced 400-pound blocks of ice, and there was a little restaurant attached to it. And you could tell a restaurant because you could see the blue smoke in the air. And from the fried foods. And they had the best fried catfish, cherry stone clams, oysters. It was a nice place to eat, But it was very southern, a lot of Cajun, And I liked it. I liked it very much, except for the bugs, of course, and the heat. But and the military training at Fort Rucker was a lot more relaxed. Our attack officer said, when we got there, said, "Look, as far as I'm concerned, you're officers at this point. You know, you have a lot of work to do now to learn to fly instruments, which is very, very intense, and then tactically learn to fly the aircraft, transition into the turbine-powered aircraft, and learn to fly tactical, and then off to Vietnam." And they didn't mess with us. You know, they didn't make us do push-ups, and you know, just so long as there weren't chunks of mud on the floor in our barracks, you know, they were happy with that. But during TAC-X, a buddy of mine, Tony Tosti, and I found this little place behind a barber shop we rented for 2 weeks, you know, because we could live off post then. And it took us 2 days to kill all the bugs, and, you know, but we loved it. It was our home. You know, we really only stayed there one weekend because during TAC-X we were in the field. And we were allowed to come home that one weekend. Then the next weekend we graduated and went home for 30 days before we took off for Vietnam.
All right. Now, how do they get you physically out to Vietnam?
Gosh, you know, that's 40-some years ago. I had to go to California, to San Francisco. Had to report to San Francisco. Had about 2 days out there to do paperwork. And then they put us on it was a civilian charter aircraft. And we went from there to Anchorage, Alaska, where we refueled. And then we went from Anchorage to Ben Hoa, which is down by Saigon.
But you didn't make another stop on the way that you can recall?
No, just Anchorage and then Ben Hoa.
Yeah. All right. And then what's your first impression of Vietnam?
It smelled terrible. It smelled, it was hot, it was humid, and there was this stink in the air that, you know, we very quickly got used to. We didn't like it, but we got used to it.
All right.
And at that point then, 101st Airborne Division had a week-long training period. They called it P training. I don't know why they call it P training, but it was to get acclimated to the weather over there, jungle conditions, jungle warfare. We had a lot of classes all day long on jungle warfare. They issued us our jungle uniforms, you know, the boots and all that. And then I went over unassigned, and once I got there, they assigned me to the 101st Airborne Division, A Troop, 2nd to 17th Cavalry, up in I Corps. Vietnam was split up into 4 corps, 4, 3, 2, 1, but they didn't call it one corps, they called it I Corps.
Yeah, because Roman numeral. Yeah.
Right. And Ben Hoa was just outside of Saigon, which is, I think, 4 corps.
No, 3rd Corps.
Was it 3rd
Yeah,
Corps?
4th Corps is Mekong Delta.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Anyway.
But yeah, but we were there for a week, and we had most of that P training class. At least there's 30 of us, 30 pilots, and they were not used to that. Usually they would have 2 or 3 pilots in this company, this P training company, which was probably over 120 soldiers, and they tried to push us around, and we kind of pushed back. There was enough of us that we could, but yeah, we had to go out and low crawl through the sand in the jungle to get used to what Vietnam was like. You know, the smells and sights and sounds, and then they put us on a C-130 transport. There was 4 of us. Went to A Troop, and of course we'd all go into flight school together. Ben Sansom, Dave Murphy, myself. No, just 3 of us.
Okay.
Just 3 of us, yeah.
All right. And where was A Troop based at that point?
We were based at Camp Eagle, which was at Hue, the ancient capital city of Vietnam, of Hue. We were just on the outskirts. Camp Eagle, of course, the symbol for the 101st Airborne Division is the eagle.
Right.
And we were between the city of Phu Bai and Hue, so they called it Hue Phu Bai.
Right.
There was a little Marine air base there at Phu Bai, but our base of operations at Camp Eagle, all our helicopters were right on Camp Eagle. We kept our observation aircraft in what we called Scabbard Valley. Scabbard, of course, is the holder for a sword. And they had dug in revetments along this really big ditch. So that's where all our loaches were. A loach is an LOH, Light Observation Helicopter, an OH-6 Cayuse. And that also was a Hughes aircraft. And then the slicks and the H model slicks, troop transports were on another section, and the Cobra gunships were up on a bit of a plateau.
Right.
So we were all, you know, pretty much all by ourselves. And Operations Shack was kind of in the middle of the whole deal.
All right. Now, what kind of aircraft did A Troop fly?
Well, A Troop, there's 3 troops within the 2nd Squadron. There's A Troop, B Troop, and Charlie Troop.
Right.
I was an A Troop, and we were a reconnaissance troop. Our mission was to find the enemy. I didn't fly with a regular aviation company, which is kind of like a UPS, or, you know, you call and we haul kind of a deal. We supported ourselves. We answered to nobody else. The scouts went out every day, probably 4 scouts on hunter-killer teams, we call them, a Loach and a Cobra gunship. You never travel alone. And so we would have 3 or 4 hunter-killer teams out all day long. And then if either one of them, some of them got in trouble or got into a firefight, which was a fun thing to do, I found out, then we would send our infantry platoon, which we called the Blues. We had, there was about 30 in that platoon, 8 what we called packs, 8 packs per aircraft, combat packs. And our slicks would take them out, insert them, they'd do their firefight, butt kicking, whatever they wanted to do, and then they would be picked up and brought back. So we were our own organic unit. We took care of ourselves. We laughed and giggled, got drunk together, and we didn't really mess with anybody else.
Okay. What kind of reception did you get when you joined the unit?
Actually, I got there, again, it was the middle of the night when I got there. They picked me up at Wei Fubai, or us, there's 3 of us. And the hooch I originally stayed at, our driver, Jeep driver, dropped us off, said, you know, just go find an empty bunk in that hooch. And it was, you know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. It was dark. I couldn't see anything because there's no lights over there. You know, we drive up and down the road at midnight and you see lights on the farmhouses and, you know, there's always lights. Over there at night, there are no lights. I mean, it's like looking in a shoebox. It is dark. So I found a bunk. I crawled in there and tried to get some sleep. And I did wake up in the morning. I had no idea where I was. You know, everything was strange. I mean, I was just looking around. It was, my God, what is this place? You know, and it was a scout hooch. There was some of the guys were on R&R, so I got to sleep in his bunk. And oh man, you know, when I woke up in the morning, I looked out the window and looked around. It was a shocker. It really was. You know, I had no idea where I was. What am I doing here?
So what did you see? What's the place look like?
Oh, golly. Like being out in the middle of a field almost, you know. There was other hooches. I could see to the east a bunch of tents and buildings, and that was headquarters of 101st at that point in time. There was a hooch next to the hooch where I was in, a hut or a house. I walked out the front door, and there was some other hooches. There was a 4-hole latrine with a water tower attached to it. It was painted orange. We called that the Howard Johnson walk-in crap house. You know, in a big open area with a volleyball net strung across it, and that was our form of recreation. Every night was a volleyball game, and various, you know, small huts, buildings. There was operations and the CO's office and Sergeant Major's office, but it was just bare dirt, gravelly dirt. Nothing I had ever seen like it. You know.
Did they have bunkers by the hooches? I mean, did you have to worry about mortar or rocket attacks?
No, not those hooches. They were pretty close to the ground. We did take a lot of rockets and mortars from the North Vietnamese. They eventually built some new hooches, and my hooch, then my new hooch, the Seabees came in and built a 16 by 32 plywood box. And the first 4 feet up was plywood, the second 4 feet was screen with a tin roof. And that's what I lived in. And there was 8 of us in that hooch. And we built a wall down the middle, so there was 2 hooches with 4 guys. And our hooch was, there was nothing between my hooch and the A Shau Valley except bad guys. I mean, my hooch was right on the perimeter. If we ever got infiltrated by sapper attacks, I'm the first house on the block. So I always slept with my 38 under my pillow. And if anybody walked in the door, they would have been greeted by a 38 round. It was a little spooky sometimes. But we got used to it. It became home. When we got our new hooches, we had to put, the old man said, you got to put sandbags. Well, the ground we were on was quite heavily sloped, and the hooch was built up. And we had to put sandbags. I swear to God, it was about 10 feet high all the way around. And we had to fill the sandbags, you know, and that's work. And the ground over there was like dry cement. It didn't shovel easily. It was dry. Oh my God, it took us forever.
All right.
You know,
Now, how quickly did you start flying missions once you got there?
After about a week. They asked me, I talked with I forgot who it was, but they said, you know, all right, what do you want to fly? I said, well, what is there to fly? Well, we got scouts, we've got slicks, and we got guns, Cobra gunships. As well, who flies the most? Scouts. Who has the most fun? Scouts. Who gets shot at the most? Scouts. All right, I want to be a scout.
Okay.
You know, I came here to fly. I didn't come here to sit in my hooch and hopefully have to go fly in a slick. I wanted to fly every damn day, you know. So then I transitioned into the OH-6. My hooch mate, Dale Kemp, who was from Texas, transitioned me into the OH-6 Cayuse, the Loach we call them. And there was a little airstrip on the edge of Hue that we would shoot approaches, takeoffs, landings, auto rotations. And it was about a 5-minute flight from our location, from Scabbard Valley. And we had to be very careful because the kids in the springtime were flying kites. So, you know, we had to be very careful not to hit one of these kites because you get a string wrapped up in your rotor system and it's going to wrap around the swash plate and your push-pull tubes will collapse and then you're headed toward the ground. So, you know, we had to navigate all the kite strings, you know. But I loved that little OH-6. It was a teardrop-shaped aircraft, high-powered, turbine-powered, 4-bladed, 4 short blades, and it was like a sports car. And then I learned to fly it very quickly. I loved it. Then I worked with a pilot who was a qualified scout, experienced scout. I flew as an observer, probably for a month, learning how to fly scouts. You know, what to do, what to look for, how to look for it, what to do when you found it. And as an observer, I always had a smoke grenade in my hand with the pin pulled. And if we took fire, I just threw the grenade out the door. We didn't fly with doors on the aircraft. We had a minigun on the aircraft, which is an electric Gatling gun, fired 4,000 rounds a minute. And it looked, the tracers looked like a red laser beam. And that's what we shot with. We had smoke grenades, we had fragmentation grenades, we had Willie Pete's, white phosphorus grenades, and we probably had a case of each on the aircraft, plus 2,000 rounds of minigun ammo. And it never really dawned on me that, you know, what if we take fire and one of these grenades get hit, like a Willie Pete, they explode to a white phosphorus into a ball of flame. Never even entered our mind, you know.
Okay. Now, where were you operating initially?
Our initial area of operations was the A Shau Valley. My unit started the fight called Hamburger Hill in early June of 1969. I got there about a week after the big fight was over. First time I ever got shot at took fire was on the backside of Hamburger Hill. But oddly enough, there's a fellow who lives in Coloma, Michigan. He was a chief warrant officer named Bob Larson. Bob started the fight in Hamburger Hill. He was working the northern A Shau Valley, and he was flying back to Firebase Currahee on the valley floor to refuel. He got a little too close to Hamburger Hill, which at that point in time was a huge hill that was just, it was an enemy fortification, bunkers, storage depot, ammunition. It was like a beehive, but we didn't know it. Bob got a little bit too close to Hamburger Hill, and he got shot at. And Bob was the kind of guy, you shoot at him, he's going to shoot back. So he turned his aircraft around and started shooting right back at him, and they shot him down. Boom. He was down in about a minute. And I wasn't there yet, of course, but they sent Bob to Japan to fix him up. He took a couple of rounds on his leg. He was in Japan for 6 months, and I met him later. But that's what started Hamburger Hill, the fight. And by the time I got there, it was just a lump of dirt, no trees. Of course, the Agent Orange that they sprayed everywhere, they defoliated the whole area. And then they put more artillery, this is what I was told, they put more artillery on Hamburger Hill during that 10 or 12-day fight than all of World War II artillery put together. I mean, this was just one big dirt hill. And the movie Hamburger Hill that came out a few years ago, to me, was nothing like the actual, you know, I did not see any of that. You know, I know they lost a lot of aircraft, because they would land on top, and a lot of men were shot down, shot up. But oddly enough, they reported that when they were sitting, they would just touch down on top of Hamburger Hill or Tiger Mountain, which is another fight. The tracers would be in front of the aircraft, and the aircraft were sitting still. And then I always wondered why. They captured some North Vietnamese, and they asked them, how come you shot in front of the aircraft? They were taught to lead the aircraft. If it's flying, you lead the aircraft, and the round hits the aircraft. But they didn't tell them they didn't have to lead the aircraft when the aircraft was sitting still. So that was a saving grace right there for a lot of people. But I got in just on the end of the Hamburger Hill fight. But then we had a lot of other fights. As a scout, my job every day was to fly a reconnaissance mission, what we called First Light, around all the fire bases on the way out to the A Shau Valley. There's Firebase Thompson, Firebase Blaze, Firebase Mary, and then once we got into the A Shau Valley, Currahee, Firebase Currahee was on the valley floor, and then Firebase Rendezvous, they built a new fire base kind of halfway up the lip of the valley. By that time we had to refuel, you know, because I'd flown around each one on the way out. We would pull pitch, we'd take off at 6:15 in the morning to the A Shau Valley, my Cobra gunship behind me, and the front seat of the Cobra would take notes. I was constantly talking, letting them know what I saw. My job was to find the enemy, to determine if there was any enemy activity from the day before. So I flew the same thing every day. So if there was new footprints, if there was new tracks, if they were pulling a cart, I could tell basically how many people had been down that trail that day or the day before. If they were pulling a cart, dragging something. And they used these spot reports then to get an idea of what the enemy was doing. So every day I did the same thing until about noon. We got out to Firebase, refueled. Then I'd do a first light down the Laotian border, right behind Hamburger Hill. Laos was right on the other side, and there was a trail right on that ridge line. So every day I'd work that trail. And if it had rained the night before, there was all kinds of footprints, you know. So it was just like my home after a while. I could tell if something was out of order.
How high above the ground would you be flying?
At the top of the trees.
Okay.
you know, just at the treetops.
But there are breaks in the trees so you can actually see down to the ground and see the trail.
Yes. It was triple canopy jungle up there. Of course, Agent Orange had defoliated a lot of it in the hot spots, but most of the A Shau Valley was triple canopy jungle, a lot of it. One day I found a Marine helicopter that had disappeared 3 years before because they used a lot of the day-glow orange color on their CH-34s. And I saw just a real quick patch of day-glow orange. That doesn't belong in the jungle. So it took me probably another 10 minutes to find that same spot. So we called our infantry platoon, and they came out and they inserted those guys. They had to rappel into the area and determined that that aircraft, a Marine CH-34, had been lost about 3 years before, never heard from. There were no bodies in it. It was shot down. And the jungle just swallows everything up. But, and then after I did my first lights, then we did a lot of work for 3rd Herd. You mentioned 3rd Battalion. We called it 3rd Herd. And we would be assigned an area to scout every day. And the Cobra would, on the map, keep me where I was supposed to go because, you know, I couldn't read a map and fly at the same time. So we went out every day looking for the enemy. We'd find a trail and fly down the trail, and you never stop moving. You're always moving, because if you leveled out, they were going to get you. They'd put a bead on you and they'd shoot you down.
Okay. Now, how long were you operating in the A Shau? Was it just the first few months, or?
No, I started flying out there in late June, early July, and then in end of January, about 10 o'clock at night, we got scrambled. The scramble bell rang 10 o'clock at night. Where the hell are you going to go at, you know, pitch dark? They sent us up to Quang Tree, which is on the DMZ. So all the slicks, all the blues, all the cobras, all the loaches, scouts, we took off at 10 o'clock at night, not knowing where the hell we're going, and went to Quang Tree. There was a Marine air base there. And we sat there for a week till we figured out what we're supposed to do, and they told us that we are to cover for the 5th Marine Division when they pull out of the DMZ area. So we moved our whole unit up to Quang Tree, moved into a Quonset hut, and had to get used to that again. And I flew scouts up there for about a month.
Okay. But now, by the time you get to January, I mean, hadn't the monsoon already come into the A Shau?
Oh, yeah.
Then?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what do you do out there? I mean, how does the monsoon affect what you do with a helicopter?
It rained constantly. There was days we couldn't fly because of the heavy rain. And late fall, early monsoon season, the air was very moist, and it would be cooler in the morning. And it was so beautiful. So many days would be a bright sunny day, and we'd work our way out to the A Shau. And the lips of the A Shau Valley were 5,000 feet above sea level. And but it looks flat, of course. And we'd get over the lip of the A Shau Valley, and the whole A Shau would be the color of this white screen right here. The fog had laid in there, and it was just like a huge bowl of milk. It was absolutely gorgeous, very serene, calm. And we'd have to turn around and go back to Firebase Blaze to refuel and sit there until the fog burned off. But there was a lot of days when it was just raining heavily. We would fly just at the treetops, you know, to get out to the A Shau Valley. And then a lot of days we got trapped in the A Shau. And one day the weather moved in so quickly, the clouds were below the lips of the valley. And it was either spend the night in the A Shau Valley, which I really didn't want to do, but we could just barely see the sun through the clouds that were thickening. So we just took off, and I just kept my eye on the sun and just flew toward the sun. And Glenn Dooley, I was training him to be a scout. Dooley was quite something. He was an warrant officer, pilot. We broke out VFR on top at 9,500 feet. Beautiful day. It was, you know, all clouds, but you know, we were on top, and we could find our way back to the back home then, back to Camp Eagle. And down below us was the Perfume River. And even from 9,500 feet, of course that was about 4,000 feet at that time above ground level, Dooley saw this lizard. They had lizards over there that looked like alligators. and they would get very big, and they'd swim in the rivers, and these lizards would come out in the evening searching for food. And there was one of these lizards swimming upstream, and Dooley spotted it. So he took his flight helmet off and took his M16, and we were a couple thousand feet above the ground. Dooley's, I'm going to get this thing. And he fired one shot and put it through the back of this lizard's head. And that thing was flopping in the waters. My God, how did he ever do that? You know, I'll never forget that, you know. And then many days coming back from the A Shau on Highway 1, we'd have to fly low and fast. And there was a ridge line that was maybe 100 feet high, and there was a pass cut through it. So you'd be flying to the east, you had to make a hard right turn, fly through the cut, and then turn south again. And I loved that pass, because I'd get going just as low and fast as I could and come around that corner with my loach, and, you know, just put it right up on the edge and, you know, just shoot through there, because I was young and loved speed. And I looked up, and there was a Chinook doing the same thing, coming right at me from the other way, you know. And that was, they say flying in Vietnam is hours and hours of sheer boredom interrupted by brief moments of stark terror. And that was one of those moments, to see this Chinook coming at me. And he's up on his right, and I'm up, and here we go, you know.
You mentioned the prospect of having to spend the night in the A Shau. Now, did we still have troops on the ground that you could stay with, or would you be on your own at that point?
I would have had to stay at the fire base.
Yeah.
I would have had to stay at the fire base, but the only weapon I had was a .38 revolver and a left-handed holster. Even though I'm right-handed, everybody used a left-handed holster, because you brought the holster around in front of you, and the weapon, the .38, would be between my legs. Number one, it was kind of like a steel armament for
protection. Yeah.
protection, and the handle of the weapon would stick out to my left side, so I can still use the collective pitch. If it stuck out to the right, I couldn't use the cyclic. So everybody used a left-handed holster. And I learned to shoot that .38 with my left hand. I'd shoot out the door. I'd see something, and bang, bang. I could still fly and shoot with my left hand. Put a lot of friction on the collective.
Do you have any prospect of hitting something with a .38 from a helicopter?
No. No. You probably have better chance if you threw the weapon at them, you know. But the minigun that we used, it fired 4,000 rounds a minute. We could walk that fire up a trail, and there was many days, many times where I would, especially when they sent us up to the DMZ, to Elephant Valley, Machine Gun Valley, Helicopter Valley, it was called. The North Vietnamese would come out of their caves and watch us fly over, because they had never seen a Loach and they had never seen a Cobra gunship. They didn't know who it was. And they just stood there. And it was really a turkey shoot.
So the Marines weren't using them up there?
They didn't know. No, they were flying the old CH-34s and the OV-10, OV-1 Broncos, which is a fixed-wing aircraft. But, you know, there hadn't been helicopters up there for years. And the North Vietnamese didn't know who we were. And there was 3 of them one day that were sitting in a bunker about the size of this mat. And I flew over them, and they waved at me. You know, and they weren't friendly, because there were no friendlies. You know, so I just did a big swooping turn, came back around and hit the trigger, and about 2 seconds later, there was 3 dead NVA there, you know. And it didn't affect me till later on that day. So, my God, I just killed 3 people. You know.
All right. Now describe sort of the activity level and what's going on once you get up to the DMZ area.
It was, oh gosh, it was, there wasn't much of the DMZ. It had been blown up, bombed, strafed, no trees, no vegetation, Agent Orange. But they were hardcore NVA troops. I did not fight against the VC, the Viet Cong.
Right.
They were down south. The people we fought against, was the North Vietnamese NVA. They were well trained for the most part, except for leading the aircraft, you know. And they were tough. Out by the Laotian border, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail came in through the corner, you didn't want to go out there, because they had 37 and 20 23 and 37 millimeter flak. Just like in the old show, 12 o'clock high. We were out there one day and these little black puffs started coming at us. And then the radar controlled 50 caliber. And those 50 caliber tracers looked like basketballs going by. And our Cobra gunship got hit, knocked out his hydraulics, so we turned tail and went back. But yeah, they protected the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And of course the B-52s hit it just about every night, and they'd get out there and with their trucks and bulldozers and rebuild it the next night, and 2 nights later they'd another arc light, B-52 strike. You could set your watch by it, But we couldn't get close to it. They had anti-aircraft weapons so close to it.
Right. Now, when you're up along the DMZ and so forth, you're supporting infantry units that go in there, or you're just scouting it to see what the enemy's doing?
Just scouting it. Just scouting it. Because the 5th Marines were pulling all of their infantry out. We worked out of a little town called My Lac, which was north and west of Quang Tri, and we staged out of there. They put a fuel depot there so we could refuel and rearm. And Quezon was close to My Lac. We flew around Quezon quite a bit. And at that point in time, it was just an old deserted fire base.
Right.
And it was great fun to try and shoot the wild pigs that ran around there, because they ran after us, and we'd try and shoot them. I flew for my CEO. I was his pilot for about a month, and he wanted a hogshead, a skull. So we would go down there and just sit at a low hover, and these huge hogs would come out and chase us. And of course, the door gunners would try and shoot one. They never did. They're too quick. So I was a little nervous because you just don't sit still in a helicopter.
So by then, are you flying slicks rather than?
Yeah, I got out of I suppose I chickened out. There was an artillery unit that had a new commander, and he wanted to go see where his artillery was hitting. So he asked an aviation company for a scout, a loach, and these guys went out alone. And the pilot should have known better, but when you have a colonel say, let's go, you go. You follow orders. They got shot down. Within minutes, they were shot down. They were flying alone. My unit went out and brought the aircraft back. They found it, slung loaded, brought it back. It's kind of gory, but there was blood and pieces of flesh all over the inside of that aircraft, the cockpit of that loach. They estimate the colonel took something like 80 hits, and the pilot took 70 hits. And of course, they were dead. And at that point in time, I said, I've had enough scouts. Wow, that scared me. So then I got into flying slicks. The CO's pilot was leaving, going home, so I said, hey, yeah. And that was all right, but it was boring. Just bored holes in the sky. We went and tracked down each of the hunter killer teams every day to see what they were doing. There wasn't any excitement. So they had an opening in the lift platoon for an aircraft commander. So I said, yeah, I'll do that. They asked me if I'd fly in a lift platoon. So yeah, I was an aircraft commander flying slicks my last 5 months.
All right. So basically kind of early first half of 1970 kind of.
Yes.
At that point.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
And now, where were you operating then in those last 5 months?
We were operating in the DMZ area, and but one of the last things I did as an aero scout, working out of My Lac, right up by Razorback Ridge is Dong Ham Mountain, and there is a big fire base at Dong Ham Mountain, which is right on the DMZ. The weather was terrible for about 3 weeks, monsoon season. And there was a full bird colonel that had been stuck out there for about 2 weeks. And he wanted to get off the mountain. And so I hovered up the side of the mountain. The weather was so bad I could hardly see. And I put my observer in the back then. We finally got up to the top. And this full bird colonel got in the aircraft. And this guy was like the size of Santa Claus. I mean, he was huge. He hadn't missed many meals up there. And he said, "Can you get me out of here?" I said, "Yes, sir, we can." You know, and of course, the only thing I could see was a little bit of the sun boring a hole through the clouds. So we lifted up, and I just kind of put the nose down the side of the mountain and got effective translational lift. And I said, "Colonel, suck it in." I mean, he had a big belly, and the cyclic was hitting his belly, and I couldn't get the nose up, you know. And I said, "Suck it in, pal." You know, finally, we got some lift, and we just followed the sun, and we broke out in better conditions and took him back to Quang Tree. He was happy to be back to Quang Tree. But then, yeah, I flew slicks then after that for our blues, our infantry. And if they had gotten a firefight someplace, downed aircraft, my troop was on downed aircraft standby for all of I Corps. If somebody got shot down, 24 hours a day, we would take off with all of our Cobra gunships, our lift platoon, scouts, and go get that aircraft. And we did that quite a bit.
Okay. And then would you do medevac flights if they couldn't get the regular medevacs in? Or?
There was a lot of medevacs up there, but if we couldn't get a medevac, yes, we did go in quite a few times and pull wounded out. When I was flying command and control, we had put in a heavy Ranger team. A heavy Ranger team was like 12 Airborne Rangers, and they were tough. I mean, they were tougher than boiled owl. Where we put them in, they got hit by a company of NVA. We put them right in the backyard of a company of NVA. And as soon as those slicks got away, they started getting fire. And we had a Loach on hand, we had a Cobra on hand, but they were out of ammunition. They were out, expended. And these guys were crying, pleading on the radio to come in and pull them out. Well, we were the only slick within 100 kilometers. You know, and these poor guys are right below us, getting their shit blown away. And the old man, the CO, looked back at my crew chief, said, "Do we have a McGuire rig on board?" Well, a McGuire rig was just a piece of 2x4 with a hole in it with a rope. And you go in and hover over whatever, and somebody sits on that 2x4 and you pull him out. And he wanted to go in with a McGuire rig and pull these guys out of there. And my heart just about stopped. That was the first time.
Yeah.
You know, the fourth time was about 7 years ago when I had my heart attack. But we didn't have a McGuire rig, you know, and if we'd have tried to go in there and pull those guys out, hover above a company of NVA, we'd have been fish food, you know. So we finally got more armament out there, and ARA came out, Aerial Rocket Artillery, and they came out and were able to blow the dinks away enough to get our slicks in and pull the 8 of the 12 that were still alive, you know. But again, moments of stark terror, you know.
Did you have situations where you would use a jungle penetrator, have to just sort of hover someplace and lower people down or pull them up?
It wasn't really a penetrator. There was
rappelling down. But I guess.
Yeah. We the old man one day at Quang Tree said, "I want all the infantry guys to go out and practice rappelling." And so we got to practice rappelling too, you know. So we hovered about 100 feet in the air, and you know, let the infantry guys slide down the rope. And they said, "You know, you want to try it?" I said, "No, no, I like flying it. I don't like jumping out of it." And the next day, we had to go in and go after a downed aircraft, and it was triple canopy jungle. It was a hot LZ, and we were in operations. All right, we got to fly 4 slicks out there into a hot LZ. We were listening to the radio of the Cobra and the Loach, giving a description of where we had to go. They were taking fire. And I got a hand-painted picture of how this is going to end up, you know, hovering on top of the trees on a hot LZ. By the time we got there, LZ had gone cold. Whew, good. Because it took about 10 minutes to repel 8 guys out of an aircraft. So I was the lead ship in, put my nose in the treetops, and they threw the rope out, and the first guy down, when he hit the ground, he took out his knife and cut the rope. Instead of unhooking the rope, he cut the repelling rope. We need about another 5-6 feet of rope behind you. So that meant the next guy out was going to end up slamming into the ground. And my crew chief said, sir, he says, he cut the rope. We got to come down. I said, I can't. The trees. He said, we got to come down, sir. Okay. So I dropped about 10 feet, and I took out a bunch of tree limbs, and there was limbs and leaves flying everywhere. And
That's a good way to damage your rotor blades, though, isn't it?
oh, yeah. I trashed a set of rotor blades. And the aircraft kept flying, and I got everybody else out. We got back to Quang Tree and shut it down, and both rotor blades underneath were just like a giant dinosaur had taken his claws and just ripped the blades to shreds. They were shot, and of course all the way home they were whistling. You could hear them whistling. You know, which was not unusual. You get shot at and get hit, and a bullet will hit the rotor blade and whistle. So you get back, you just file off the rough edges and put some 400-mile-an-hour green tape on it and go fly. You know, not a big deal. You know, but oh yeah, a rotor blade cost $10,000 by the time it got to Vietnam, and I trashed $20,000 worth of rotor blades in about 5 minutes one day. But luckily, the aircraft stayed together.
Over the course of the year when you're there, did you have any real feel for how the larger war was going, or?
No. We flew for each other. We didn't really fly for the ARVNs, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. We would insert ARVN troops in the morning, and then we'd go pick them up at the same spot in the afternoon. You know, whatever. You know, we were flying for each other, our own troops. You know, the GIs. That's who we were really supporting and flying for, and that.
But you're not thinking about, you know, whether we're winning or losing or anything like that.
No.
You're just there doing the job.
Yeah, you know, we just barely covered our own butts. You know, we didn't have time to think about what it was like anyplace else. You know.
Yeah. How much did you see of the Vietnamese military or civilian in the time you were there?
We saw very little of civilians. 101st Airborne Division, all cities and towns were off limits. And so we flew over the city of Hue a lot, especially at night. We'd get a lot of gunfire. They'd take pot shots at us, tracers would come up and say, hey, we're the friendly, you know, you guys are supposed to be the good guys, you know, quit it. But we had to get a special pass even to drive through Hue. We wanted to go up to the PX at Camp Sally, or Camp Evans. We heard they had a really neat PX. I had a day off, and we had to get a special pass just to drive through the city of Hue to go up to Camp Evans. And I took a lot of slide pictures of it, and it's just an ancient Asian town. And there was outdoor markets where dead dogs, dead cats, dead ducks and chickens were hanging upside down with their heads, and the smells and sights and sounds were something I wasn't used to. You know, and that's really the only time I got into a civilian town.
Now, did they have any civilians working on the bases?
Yeah, they did. At Camp Eagle, they had some civilian maintenance people, and we had a 25 kW generator that powered our whole camp. And this Vietnamese fella cut the common ground wire, and then that whole generator just exploded. So we were without electricity for a couple months. You know, they had smaller gasoline-powered things to power things like operations, but we had no electricity in our hooches, just candlelight.
I mean, did they have civilians in there doing, you know, laundry or menial tasks?
No, I did my own laundry.
Okay.
You know, and there was a PX there at Camp Eagle. And I'd go get my hair cut over there. It was a little strange when I first got my hair cut. An old Vietnamese fella. And just sit on a stool. I mean, it's not a store like you think of a barbershop. You know, it's just an old, they would use cardboard or old U.S. plywood and make this hut. And it was a hand-powered clippers. And he'd cut the hair. And then he'd get out a straight razor to trim around the ears. And the first time I got my hair cut, he pulled out that straight razor. I thought, I know what he's going to do, you know. But then we got a new guy in our unit who had been a barber in civilian life. So he did our haircuts from then on. And they had a laundry over there to PX. I sent my laundry over there one day, all my flight suits and my jungle fatigues, and it came back and it smelled terrible. Oh my God, what is that rotten smell? Come to find out, they used dried water buffalo dung to heat their little furnace to dry the clothes. Because I don't know if you've ever smelled the smoke that dried water buffalo dung produces, but I could not wash it out. I could not wash it out, you know.
All right. How would you characterize morale in your unit, the attitude of the men themselves?
It depended on what you did. The pilots, we were all gung-ho. You know, we enlisted to fly, and we wanted to fly. We enjoyed it. We loved it. It was a game to go out and see how many Vietnamese you could get. And the guys took that game very seriously. We loved to fly. The infantry guys who had been drafted, they hated it. You know, on the other side, like myself, I loved it. You know, I flew just about once I started flying, I flew every day for 9 months. And Captain Carney finally gave me an afternoon off. He said, you know, you're flying too much. I said, yeah, so? And we had an aircraft shot down, and I had to take a spare aircraft out to the A Shau Valley that day, you know. I got to fly today, you know. I loved it. I joined up and enlisted to fly, and that's what I did. I loved it, every minute of it.
Okay. Now back in the bases, if you're at Camp Eagle or one of these other places, were there morale issues or problems that you saw? Race or drugs or other things?
It was rumored that there was a lot of drugs over on the infantry side. I got a new roommate. I don't remember his name except for Sid. He was brand new, and he went to the wrong latrine. He stumbled into the latrine where the infantry guys used, and they were in there smoking some, you know, their dope. So he walked out. Everybody thought he was CID, so everybody started calling him Sid. And that's the only name I remember him from. And he'd been there about a month, and they sent him out on a reportive survey. If something is lost, stolen, broken, destroyed in the military, you have to do a reportive survey. I did a couple because some infantry guys somewhere lost their M16. So I'd have to go interview them, and write up a report, just report a survey, turn it in. Well, the 101st Airborne Division lost a swimming pool.
Okay.
So yeah, a swimming pool. There's Gulf of Tonkin. I know that. You know, but swimming pool. Come on. So Sid, my hooch mate, who had not flown at all yet in any missions, he got that report of survey, and he was gone for about 8 weeks. He was all over Vietnam trying to find that swimming pool. Actually, he found it the second day, but he had been in the military long enough, he played the game. And because he got TDY, temporary duty pay,
Right.
you know, like $15 a day. So he made out like a bandit. He was down Saigon partying, you know. Then about 8 weeks later, he showed up. You know.
Did you find out who had the pool?
Yeah, it was lost in a supply room someplace. The tags had come off
So
of
it
it.
hadn't just been swapped to a Marine unit or something who were not using it?
No,
Okay.
it was there at Camp Eagle. They just didn't know what it was. But he found it the second day, and 8 weeks later he showed up. So.
Yeah. Now, some of the base camps, by the time you get to 1970, I mean, the standard line is, you know, there's a lot of racial tension and things like that, and gangs of black troops wandering around on the bases and stuff making trouble. I mean, did that go on?
Not at Camp Eagle that I knew, because every day I pulled pitch at 6:15 to the A Shau Valley, and I would get back maybe during the summer 8, 9 o'clock at night. I'd get back, you know. So what happened at Eagle stayed at Eagle.
Right.
When we were moved up to Quang Tree, the 5th Marines were still in charge of the mess hall, and they had the best food in the world. And we had to walk by, to get to the mess hall from our company area, we had to walk by a company of men who were, let's say, misfits, troublemakers.
Yeah.
And they put them in this company, and we made sure we walked way around them because they were mean and nasty. You know. Yeah. So yeah, I think those places did exist. You know, did exist. And while we were up there, we got a new commander for the lift platoon. We called him Captain America, and he was a great guy. And he was gung-ho, and he said, "All right," he said, "when we go out, let's everybody tape 2 smoke grenades to the skids of the aircraft, one on each side, the skids under the cross tubes on the back, and we'll do this low flyby over the runway at Quang when we come in." And they staggered the colors, and one of them had white smoke. And there's blue, there was red, and green, white, and yellow. I forget who had the white smoke. And when the crew chief put them on the cross tubes, of course the aircraft, when the aircraft sits, there's a lot of weight on the cross tube, and they'll spread just a little bit. And he hooked up the wire to the pin on, so when we're flying, you just pull the pin out, and the smoke grenade goes off. Well, this thing was like a G-string on a guitar. So when we lifted up, the cross tubes flexed down a little bit. Of course, pulled the pins, and all the smoke started coming out in the revetment. So we learned that lesson. But the day we were going to come and make this strafing run with, like, the Thunderbirds, everybody popped smoke, and the white smoke was CS gas. There were CS grenades, riot gas. And we made this low, fast flyby over the base at Quang, and we gassed everybody, inadvertently. So that was the last time we did that.
Okay. Now, a lot of people report that as they get toward the end of the tour, that their kind of attitude or whatever changes a little bit, or they're counting down the days or whatever. And what was the end of your tour like?
I had about 2.5 weeks to go, and in my unit, you could, if you didn't want to do anything the last week or two, work on your tan to go home. Well, I didn't tan, I just burned, which caused complications later in life. But I had come back in from the AO, Area of Operations, one day. It was about 8 o'clock at night, and one of the guys in my hoot said, "You got to go south tomorrow." Well, I had gone down to Play Coup to pick up a loach, LOH. They needed one. So me and a crew chief flew down to Play Coup to the rebuild center, picked out a loach, and flew it back home. I thought, well, me being, ready to go home, I get another one of these missions. It's cool. And I said, well, I have to go pick up a loach at Play Coup. And they said, no, you're going home. No, I don't go home for 2.5 weeks yet. Well, you got a 2-week drop. And I picked up the orders and read them. I was supposed to be in Cameron Bay the next day to go home. So it happened just that quick. I didn't have a chance to take a couple weeks off and sit back and smoke cigars and drink beer, or whatever. I went home the very next day.
All right. Now, are there other particular incidents or things that stand out in your memory about the year in Vietnam that you haven't brought in yet?
There was good times and bad times. I saw a lot of warfare, which is expected in war. But the thing I really looked forward to the most was Christmas Day at Camp Eagle, 1969. Bob Hope was going to be with Miss America, and all the June Taylor dancers were going to be at Camp Eagle. And everybody was going to go to the Bob Hope show. During the Christmas truce, we still flew, but it was a truce between the Vietnamese, the good guys and bad guys. We had a Christmas party on Christmas Eve, and the hooch that was adjacent to ours, we were hanging from the rafters. I think I drank half a bottle of gin that night, or wine, whatever it was. We were all just, we'd partied. into late in the night. And we were sitting around in the morning, Christmas Day. It was about 10 o'clock, just sitting on the ground. We were drinking Tom and Jerry's to sober up. Captain Carney, my platoon leader, came through and said, "Can anybody fly?" And I said, "What?" He says, "You can talk, you can fly."
Okay.
I said, "Oh, no." And he said, "Yeah." I said, what's going on?" He said, we need a hunter-killer team, Loach and a Cobra, to go out and do a first light inspection around all the troops out in the field to make sure the North Vietnamese aren't sneaking up on them on Christmas Day. Crap. Well, get this done for the Bob Hope show. So we took off, and we could fly about an hour and 45 minutes before we had to refuel. And at that point in time of the year, a lot of grandmas and moms sent cookies to soldiers in Vietnam. And we had stacks of boxes in our hooch. Everybody did. So on the way back to fuel, I called operations and said, "Hey, run up to my hooch and get all these boxes of cookies and take them down to the Loach line, you know. And after I fuel, I'll come in, I'll pick up some cookies. And get the mail. And these units that are out in the field, go get their mail." So the rest of the day, Ross Edlin, who was flying the Cobra, and myself did a first light inspection, dropped off cookies, and dropped off mail on Christmas Day.
Very good. Did you get to see Bob Hope?
No. No, I didn't. I got to see something better.
Right.
I get choked up when I think about it. You know, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have run out of session time here.
Oh,
We managed
shoot.
to get you through your Vietnam story.
Yeah.
So
Well, there was, if I can, just one quick story. I mentioned that my wife and I are into MGs, sports cars. And a few years ago, my boss at Steelcase said, "Pal of mine's got an old MG in a barn. He wants to get rid of it." So we went out. All right, this barn find, right? It's going to be Concours car. It was junk, rusty. But I took it anyway because I pulled the engine and transmission out of it. There was a map pocket. And in the map, and my wife said, "Well, get the map pocket. We'll put it in our car." All right. And there, inside the map pocket was a little steel plate. It was a first owner plate. It was almost like dog tags. It had the name John S. Richards, first WOC, CL 69-1, Fort Walters, Texas. I said, "I'll be damned." The guy who owned this car was John S. Richards, was in Fort Walters, Texas. He was a warrant officer candidate, class 69-1. I was in class 6911, and I had my first MG at Fort Walters, Texas. So John S. Richards and Noel H. Miller were there at the same time, both of us with MGs.
Very good.
So I called up my insurance company, USAA, and they were able to help me locate John S. Richards, and I called him, and he called me back. He said, "I'm John S. Richards, and that's my car." So, and he was originally from Portage, and he now lived in South Carolina. And he was coming up to Grand Rapids area, to Michigan, the next week to go fishing with his buddies. So he came to my house, and we met, and he was pretty big by this time. But he and his brother-in-law got out of a pickup truck, and we talked. It was in the driveway. And I pulled my garage door opener out of my pocket. I said, "Here, push that little gray button." And the garage door went up, and there sat his little MG, and tears came out of his eyes.
All right.
And we connected. You know, he flew medevac down by Saigon, and I was up north. But you know.
All right. Well, if you decide later on there's sort of more stories to tell, we can always come and record more in any
I'd like
time
to.
we have
I'd like to.
get out of the way for the high school kids.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming.
Thank
today.
you. Thank you very much.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.